Welcome to today's panel discussion on the road to recovery for Atlantic tourism. My name is Kevin Quigley. I'm the Scholarly Director of the McEachern Institute for Public Policy and Governance. As we begin this event, we acknowledge we are here in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We also recognize the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who've been here for over 400 years. Over the next few weeks, we'll be hosting panels every Thursday. Last week, we opened our series with a panel on long-term care. Next week, on March 4th, we will discuss climate adaptation, and on March 11th, we'll be discussing racial politics. Many other topics could have been selected. These particular topics were picked because they are important and represent research and community engagement that we're working on currently at the McEachern Institute. Our intention is to create an opportunity for frank exchange among experts about important issues that impact our communities. These events are not strictly about characterizing the problem, but also about identifying solutions. We've encouraged our panelists to share forward-looking ideas and policies in light of the challenges and opportunities that we will be discussing. Our hope is that these ideas will be shared, discussed, and tested widely, that good ideas will emerge and will be taken up by our politicians in the upcoming provincial election, set to occur likely sometime within the next year. To further support this initiative, we are hosting an op-ed competition open to all registered Dalhousie University students. In addition to cash prizes for winning submissions, selected op-eds may be published on our website, and all entrants will be invited to an online workshop hosted by the McEachern Institute on pitching an op-ed to the media. You can check out our website for details on the op-ed competition. The deadline for submissions is March 4th. We know Zoom fatigue is real, and with this in mind, we will keep our sessions short to 1 hour. There will be a brief opportunity for audience questions at the end of today's session. So on today's topic, over the last year, the McEachern Institute has been conducting research on tourism in Atlantic Canada and working closely with the local tourism community here in Halifax. It's an important industry for us in Atlantic Canada and has been hit hard by COVID-19. But tourism is not strictly a local sport. Tourism is part of a global network. What is affecting us here in Nova Scotia is also having an impact in markets in Canada, the US, Europe, and indeed right around the world. It's been noted that 1 in 10 jobs on the planet depends on tourism. Such is the importance of the sector. I'm pleased to be joined by a panel of experts with strong local and international perspectives that can help us to understand the challenges that lie ahead and recommend some ways forward in the short and medium term. Each speaker is invited to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll follow up with some discussion and take some questions from the audience. To start things off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ross Jefferson. Ross is the president and CEO of Discover Halifax, the regional destination marketing organization responsible for overseeing the growth of the tourism economy in Halifax. Ross will provide insights into the local tourism industry and the policies we need to develop to address what lies ahead. Over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here on the panel today, and also just a recognition of the McEachern Institute of the work that's been doing to help the industry, as well as many other policy issues in the last little while. I'm going to just try and bring one idea to light here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and I've got an image up right now that might be a typical image. When someone says travel, this might be something that comes to mind. And of course, what you're seeing here is an image that is obviously pre-pandemic. When I look at this image, I think about actually the complicated supply chain and all of the work that comes together to make this happen. And I'm not really talking just about the event that you're looking at the screen. If you really trace back the full supply chain for a visitor, it might look something like this. So, if you think about anyone in this audience that may be sitting here, first of all, how are they inspired? Where did they know or learn about the event that was going on? They may have seen it from a tourism or a television ad that was created by a DMO, that was developed by a marketing agency. The event itself that's being promoted had to be developed. So a sponsor, somebody like Develop Nova Scotia, would have had to contract with an event planner, busker performers, audiovisual companies. But the financing before that would have to come from somewhere as well. And today, much of that coming from a hotel levy that's collected in our community. Any visitor here may have booked with a travel agent, who have worked with a tour operator, who in turn put a package together working with the motor coach operator, the airline, a hotel. And when you dive down a little further, thinking the motor coach company, they're hiring bus drivers. They've got mechanics that they have to make sure that their buses are inspected. I think you kind of get the idea here that, throughout the entire supply chain, the visitor experience touches on so many different businesses. And we could go through this at great length. This is one example. But there's a new player in town, and that's actually public health. I would argue that public health and the government now is a critical stakeholder in the supply chain for the development of tourism. And I would say that this system is not a managed system. It's an evolved system over decades, and it works really well at a steady state. It's just become, but we are not at a steady state anymore. And in fact, we're at a shutdown. And the shutdown, I would argue, is not just going to return when we flip a switch. It needs to be managed. Consider now that 30% of the workforce in tourism is now gone, as compared to December last year, and 40% compared to our peak months. And many of these people are not just sitting waiting to be hired back. Mechanics are now working elsewhere, as are drivers, cleaning staff, boat captains for tours. And this startup will require advance notice. And in fact, many cases, it could be 3 to 4 months before businesses can even really start up. And, it's also about a point of scale. Again, we've always been in this steady state, but this has to be able to be scaled back up for 5.3 million overnight stays alone in HRM, as it's a $1.3 billion industry that has really come to a halt. But today the entire supply chain is really tied to restrictions, now managed by a new partner who is outside of the industry. And now, as we really think about getting back, I think one of the most critical things that we could be doing right now is understanding, when are we about to start back? What is that going to look like? Will we be able to have this season? And I really want to be clear that I'm not advocating for government to provide a date and to hold them to that. Not at all. I don't think that this is possible, and I don't think that this is reasonable. It is obviously a very complicated question right now. But what I think we can do is drive coordination between health planning and business planning. A business having a clearer picture of the vaccination schedule might be the most important piece of information that they have about their decision to open or close, as an example. And if we do it right, there's a strong benefit to being prepared. Just assuming that we have a 10% improvement over not being prepared, that would translate to $260 million in visitor spending in Halifax alone, and $40 million in sales taxes to the province. Now, I wouldn't want to be the person responsible for the vaccination program, and I'm sure it's incredibly complicated. And tourism is not the priority, nor should it be for the vaccination program. But I think the opportunity might simply be to connect the two. Communications alone to allow business planning to make their own assumptions. Today, I think we're making a mistake also by distilling these issues down to a trade-off between economic justification and the opening of health risks associated with COVID. And I think we're making a big mistake here. Travel is not just about a selfish pleasure that we can do without. Did you know that travel to visiting friends and family accounts for about half of all travel? And health is not just about COVID exposures. Today, many families are separated. Important life events like attending funerals and being there to support families who are in need of help are going without. People living with dementia are isolated. Mental health is being described as a shadow pandemic. So, I think that taking a look at what the real goal is right now and probably advocating for to be something around total harm reduction would be a great goal for us to strive towards. And I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Kevin. Thank you. Just unshare my screen, I think. Back to you. Thanks, Kevin.
Excellent. Thanks, Ross. Next, I'd like to introduce Michelle McKenzie. Michelle McKenzie is a corporate director and business advisor and founder of McKenzie Business Strategies. She's the former president and CEO of the Canadian Tourism Commission, or Destination Canada, and former deputy minister of Nova Scotia Tourism, Culture and Heritage. In 2020, she was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Tourism Association of Canada. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon. The tourism sector, as Ross mentioned, demonstrated resilience and innovation in pivoting to the local market in 2020. But the local market is not a solution to sustain Atlantic Canada's tourism competitiveness into the future. Tourism businesses are struggling to survive and the future remains uncertain. So what can governments do to support the sector in recovery? I'm going to share 6 specific thoughts. The first one, words matter. We know that the recovery of Canadian tourism will be driven by the domestic market. This will create demand that's initially high volume but low yield. Government needs to appreciate that the build back to higher value travel, essentially people who arrive on airplanes, will take a long time. I'm reminded of the statements that were made when the Atlantic bubble was opened last summer. The fact that there were lineups at the borders was touted as evidence that tourism was back. And of course, this is not the case. Lineups will always attract media attention, but people traveling to visit friends and relatives and local pleasure travelers, while they're important, they will not support the economic recovery of Atlantic Canada's tourism sector. Governments can help by supporting longer-term planning, by investing in patient supports for the industry, and importantly, by watching their words and releasing thoughtful statements that put the situation in perspective and educate our populations about long-term tourism goals. Number 2, focus on air. Governments need to recognize that the air switch that was turned off last year cannot simply be turned back on. It will take a long time for Atlantic Canada to build back air access to anywhere near what we had in 2019. And in some instances, routes may be gone forever. There are, of course, many reasons for this, but the crux of the matter is that airlines have been devastated. They've sold equipment and they've laid off staff. In building back, they will be seeking to stay as lean as possible, and they will make decisions through the lens of profitability. Airlines have always relied on profitable routes to subsidize break-even or losing routes. And they've always relied on passengers, primarily business travelers, in the front of the plane to subsidize those in the back of the plane. So the combination of the most profitable routes first and expected lower ongoing demand for business travel means that it will take time to see our connectivity return to the Halifax-Stanfield International Airport. So I'm just going to share my screen here, share some slides. So this is a route map with service plan for Halifax-Stanfield International Airport pre-pandemic. This is a 2020 route plan. And this is the route map today. I think you will agree that the image is shocking and brings many concerns to mind. For the purpose of this discussion, I'd like to note 2 points. It will take at least 3 years for the Halifax route map to return anywhere near to pre-COVID levels, bringing those high-value visitors. And also, the position of Halifax as a hub airport to support tourism throughout all of Atlantic Canada will be more important than ever. The third point, clarity. We know there's pent-up demand for travel, but will Atlantic Canada be ready and willing to roll out the welcome mat when restrictions are lifted? And this relates to kind of the remarks that Ross just mentioned. So we're all well aware of the 14-day quarantine for international visitors coming into Canada. 14-day quarantines in Atlantic Canada are separate from this and apply to Canadian travelers as well. Keep in mind that such restrictions applied to Canadians are not currently in place elsewhere in Canada, other than Manitoba and the Northern Territories. With the vaccine rollout well underway and opportunities to harmonize testing regimes, the tourism sector needs clarity from the Atlantic Canada provincial governments about the conditions under which the provincial 14-day quarantines could be reduced or eliminated. Why? Because the domestic travel market will drive Canada's tourism recovery overall, and Atlantic Canada wants to be part of that recovery. Number 4, rolling out the welcome mat. According to the resident sentiment survey conducted by Destination Canada, the most recent results are February 2nd, Canadians remain negative about welcoming international visitors, and only a minority of residents in any region of Canada would welcome visitors from other parts of the country. In fact, Atlantic Canadians' willingness to welcome visitors from other parts of the country is among the lowest in the country. I call this our afraid welcome mat. Governments in Atlantic Canada have done a very good job of rolling up the welcome mat when health conditions required. But do they see a role in helping to roll the welcome mat back out and help to change resident sentiments to travelers when health conditions allow? Number 5, keep the rural wave going. Rural tourism businesses in Nova Scotia did well in 2020 compared to their urban counterparts as demand grew within the Atlantic bubble for locations with lots of outdoor space and experiences. And this is in keeping with a national trend where nearly 90% of overall searches are for trips to rural areas. So not to diminish the important needs of urban centers and their role as an engine of tourism in Atlantic Canada. And by the way, TIAC has included an excellent recommendation to the federal government about the need to develop a business events and urban recovery funding program. There will be significant opportunities to redevelop tourism industry in ways that can address historical challenges related to the concentration of visitors and unequal distribution of wealth. What are governments doing to focus on these opportunities? And what can be done to ensure the rise of rural tourism continues post-pandemic and is not a blip on the tourism statistics radar screen? And finally, number 6, the strategic use of stimulus funding. Building Back Better gives us the opportunity to rethink how tourism planning takes place and to consider a community-first approach, an approach which sees tourism not just about economic growth, but sustainable, inclusive growth, which is good for the community. And Ross is a great example, having just released the Halifax Tourism Master Plan, which identifies a list of projects that both serve the community and will drive tourism in the future. Governments can support tourism recovery by aligning stimulus investments with projects identified by such community-first master planning efforts. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Kevin.
Excellent. Thanks, Michelle. Some very thoughtful ideas there. I'd like to now turn it over to Melissa Cherry. Melissa is currently the Chief Operating Officer at Destinations International, has spent over 20 years in the tourism industry. Melissa has worked in tourism in Los Angeles and Chicago, and she's currently based in Washington, D.C. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin first by giving a little context on who we are at Destinations International. Oh, hold on. Let me do that one more time. Pardon my pause here. Okay. So let me begin again. Destinations International is the world's largest international trade association and resource for official destination organizations, convention visitors bureaus, and tourism boards. We exist to serve over 5,700 members and partners from nearly 600 destinations in 13 countries globally. It is our vision that our members are essential to the success of destinations worldwide, and it is our mission to empower our members so that their destinations excel by informing, inspiring, and educating our members to drive destination economic impact, job creation, community sustainability, and quality of life through travel. So for our conversation today on how we can support the tourism sector in the post-pandemic recovery, I first want to really start about how important it is for strategic alignment with key stakeholders will be extremely critical in the post-pandemic recovery. We can all agree that growing a vibrant and diverse economy benefits us all. At Destinations International, we have argued long and hard that the tourism industry too fills a community need, that each of our destination organization members, like that Discover Halifax, provide necessary services. We make the argument that in today's global economy, every community must compete with every other for its share of the world's visibility. That also means that every community must compete for its share of the world's tourists, their share of consumers, and their share of valuable talent. Those communities who fail to actually compete will be left behind as we begin to think through this recovery. To compete, people need to be aware of a destination, have a positive impression, and want to visit, and experience the community and meet its people. This is really achieved through clearly developing, articulating, and managing the community or a destination's brand. Efforts must be made to promote, market, sell, and engage potential visitors. And all of this must be reinforced again and again. And destination organizations are uniquely positioned to do just that, just like Discover Halifax. So To take this a little step further, addressing this need for destination branding and promotion is for the benefit and well-being of every person in the community. Destination branding and promotion is an essential investment to develop opportunities and build quality of life to benefit all of the residents of the community. We all know that a community needs infrastructure, public space, transportation, et cetera, but that alone is not enough. Destination International continues to argue that for a destination to compete, people need to be made aware of that destination. They need to hear about it. They need to be able to find it when they're searching for it, plan, et cetera. People must have a clear and positive image of the destination's brand that will create a desire for people to visit the destination, to experience the community and the people for themselves. It is critical for that alignment through the civic leaders, through elected officials, through the tourism community, that destination organizations are in a key position as an authority in the industry to develop and drive that dynamic economic opportunities within a community. So from the perspective of Halifax as a viable destination and leading into the recovery, there is a critical need to recover from the loss of jobs in the tourism sector. And we need to start with a thought process, and we need to think about change, but not from a status quo perspective. In your pipeline, there are several opportunities already in place that, to begin this process. Though I do want to note, this is a long-term process and commitment for recovery. You've just heard both Ross and Michelle talk about a few of these already, but Canada passing a massive stimulus bill in December for a new federal tourism growth strategy with funds earmarked for tourism, the Atlantic bubble. I know that this is a huge debate. But the guidelines your government has put in place allows for destinations to actually recover faster compared to other destinations globally that did not have this advantage, that have been hit dramatically by this pandemic. Fourth, Halifax is a major gateway. I know it'll take time to build those routes back in, but you are a major point of entry for your region, both domestically and internationally. And finally, Discover Halifax laid the groundwork for a tourism master plan before this pandemic began, and already having that in place puts the destination ahead of the curve. And I know there are many other opportunities that continue to be leveraged. So all of these opportunities that I just mentioned will lead to growth. And with growth, you will need talent to foster that innovation. So here's a recommendation to consider. At Destinations International, we work to encourage industry leadership and stakeholders to grow an inclusive and equitable workforce that reflects the level of diversity we wish to welcome to our destinations. We recognize how critical inclusivity is to foster innovation and bring together a wide variety of voices when promoting tourism and sustaining our economies. In order to grow a diverse and equitable workforce, we need to advocate for the strategic development of local workforce development plans through collaboration with local government, non-governmental agencies like Discover Halifax, corporate and economic development organizations. As a point of reference, McKinsey & Company researched the financial impact of diversity in companies across industries. Their May 2020 report, Diversity Wins, reviewed over 1,000 companies in 15 countries globally. They found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 36% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians and 25% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians for gender diversity. In contrast, their report also revealed the negative impact to companies in the bottom quartile for both gender and ethnic and cultural diversity, as being 29% less likely to achieve above average profitability than were all other companies in their data set. So there have been countless published reports, studies from academia, corporations, and other organizations that further support that diverse and inclusive teams tend to be more creative and innovative than homogeneous teams by bringing experiences, perspectives, and approaches to solving day-to-day business challenges. Diverse teams are also better equipped to target and serve diverse consumer markets, such as women, ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ+ communities who currently serve an increasing share of consumer purchase power that is often overlooked or not even leveraged by many organizations. And finally, according to McKinsey & Company report, the business case for diversity suggests that diversity beyond gender and racial ethnicity, as well as diversity of experience, are also likely to bring levels of competitive advantage for organizations that are able to attract and retain diverse talent. To share an example, in Louisville, Kentucky, here in the US, the local hotel general managers were concerned about a new facility, convention center, hotels, distilleries were being developed and built, but they were concerned that the talent would come from these, where would this talent come for these new positions? As these new assets were being built, you would have the talent that exists moving to that, and then you still have the existing assets. So they were very concerned about how they were going to source that lack of talent, how they were going to be prepared for that talent as this construction developed, and how that could lead to poor service, poor visitor experience, and ultimately damage to the destination brand. So from a first strategy perspective, they met with agencies focused on getting adults to work. So agencies like Catholic Charities, Kentucky Refugee Ministries, Salvation Army, Goodwill, et cetera, with their focus was really to establish these relationships to be a point of contact for job opportunities. The second strategy was meeting with colleges and universities. Colleges and universities are really important and critical to the relationships to connect students with the travel and tourism industry for work, internships, et cetera. So it was critical for these partnerships to be established to drive awareness not only of the tourism industry, but also that the tourism industry is a viable career path and pipeline. And the third strategy, developing a program partnership with their local public school system and an economic development agency, again, highlighting that critical triangle I shared earlier. With their economic development agency and the development of this program, they were able to connect business community with high schools and starting early on to get specific sector academics really aware of the ability to go into a career path into tourism. Today, Tourism Louisville has put through over 400 students through this program. Now, I do want to note, this was all pre-pandemic, but the approach would still apply today as we work toward industry recovery. And it has to be a long-term strategy, and I can't reinforce this enough, but to rebuild in an innovative way and an approach that is more inclusive so that our destinations can return back to where we are and exceed before. So Kevin, back to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Melissa. We're going to now invite Tom Baum to join us with some thoughts. Tom is a professor of tourism employment in the Department of Work, Employment and Organization at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. His work has taken him to over 50 countries, and over the past year, he's written extensively on the subject of COVID-19 on international tourism and what the future might hold. So with that, over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just to explain my background, it's the island of Staffa, Fingal's Cave, one of our westerlymost islands, probably the closest to Atlantic Canada as you can get in Scotland. And my reason for selecting Fingal's Cave, or just rural Scotland, as my backcloth really chimes with what Michelle referred to when she talked about the importance of rural, of more remote peripheral destinations within Atlantic Canada. My own travels there, and I spent quite a lot of time a few years ago on a project working in PEI and Newfoundland, with also some travels in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, made me realize how similar our industries are in terms of the impact of seasonality, and how the whole nature of employment in the micro businesses, the small businesses which dominate the sector, are so important to the industry. And what I want to just touch on today is the impact of COVID-19 on employment, but particularly on employment opportunities for our youth, for the youngest people who enter the industry. And we're an industry that depends very, very heavily on youth. Whether they've come through the college route or whether they are transiting through tourism on the way to other careers. And what we've seen globally over the last year has been a devastation of the workforce. I acknowledge the impact on businesses. I'm not trying to suggest that it's only the workforce that has borne the brunt of this, but we have to recognize that that tourism workers have been at the forefront in terms of the loss of life, in terms of the impact of the pandemic. And we've seen the impact right across all sectors of tourism, from airlines to hotels to street food operators, both within the formal and the informal economy. And I think undoubtedly has been a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable in the tourism workforce: youth, women, minorities, the lowest skilled and the disabled. And that fits in really with with Melissa's argument just now. And tourism businesses and tourism workers have frequently struggled in the face of accessing the government support that's available. Many of them are, particularly seasonal workers, certainly in this country, were not eligible for support because they hadn't been in position long enough, for example. My main concern really is we talk a lot about the need to instill confidence, both in local residents, as Melissa suggested, but also in visitors, giving people the confidence to travel. And I would argue, and I strongly argue, and this is based on a number of studies we've undertaken internationally, that there's an equal need to instill and redevelop, rekindle confidence in our workforce, who have been hit very, very badly, particularly by things like the stop-start nature of the industry. We've had a number of restarts of the tourism and hospitality industry here in Scotland. We're currently in lockdown. The industry's dead. It'll come back again in April, and who knows where it'll go after that. And this all, if you like, builds up a perception of the industry among young people and their influencers, families, schools, or the like, that this is not an industry that offers a sustainable and long-term future. And if you compound that with the if you like, the structural challenges of rural destinations with seasonality, we are in a very, very precarious position. So my sort of focus thinking about policy here is that we need government to take leadership here. And in Canada, you do have the infrastructure, you do have the human resource bodies, Tourism HR Canada, and at provincial level, bodies like Nova Scotia Tourism Human Resource Council. You have the vehicles with their programs in place, and those need to be reorientated and resourced sufficiently by provincial and federal governments to provide the sort of support that will instill that sort of confidence. If we think about students at the universities and colleges in Atlantic Canada studying hospitality and tourism, who have seen their internships cancelled, both internationally and in some cases domestically as well, their opportunities. We've sold tourism to young people as a passport to global travel. That's gone. The world is no longer their oyster. Atlantic Canada may be their oyster, but whether that will satisfy Gen Z, I don't know. I think we face real challenges there. So we need to be able to offer employers some form of incentive to take on interns when their own business levels are poor. And it's great that in the Atlantic bubble you are traveling, but the reality is that the economic returns of domestic tourism, local tourism, are significantly lower than that of international tourism. So businesses will be strapped in terms of meeting their labor costs. So I think what we need is a tripartite coalition of government, the private sector, and educational providers, which addresses the long-term future, the long-term opportunities of young people entering tourism. If we cut off that supply now, it'll be very, very difficult in the longer term to resurrect it, to bring it back into position. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Tom. Some excellent comments there. Excellent comments from all the panelists and quite a wide range of comments. So I'm going to try to pull it together and ask some questions and maybe ask you to expand on some of these points as we further our discussion. So for the next 10, 15 minutes, we're going to share some thoughts as a panel collectively, and then I'll try and grab a few questions from the audience. I'll try to get through some of these key themes that you've raised. I'm going to start with you, Ross. A question for you about instilling confidence and maybe picking up on the comment that Michelle raised around people being a little bit nervous welcoming people back. Not everyone has fared as well as Atlantic Canada has, as you know, in terms of containing COVID-19. And some of this polling data that Michelle was referring to suggests that Atlantic Canadians are a little nervous about welcoming tourists to the region. So how do we instill confidence in the local population such that we will welcome tourists back to our communities? And perhaps also, on Tom's point, instilling confidence in the workforce also, in those working in tourism, so they can feel good about their job and that they should be confident that they're safe and secure.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. I think the first thing and the most important thing that we can do to instill confidence is, the continued vaccine rollout. We're probably, well ahead. If we had a thought about this a year ago, we're probably really well ahead in terms of finding a vaccine, to getting it started. Now looking at 3 and 4 possible approved vaccines for Canada here soon and shortly. I think we're really on the doorstep of actually being able to have back to real normal, hopefully soon. Now, we all know that there's still a number of potential risks and unknowns out there. So, I don't want to completely paint a full rosy picture, but I think the bigger question is not really about the vaccines, but the matter of safety is actually it's not a question of absolutes. It's the matter of an opinion. And, let's assume, I think that we all agree that COVID may be staying around with us forever. Something similar to like the flu or something like that might be. And I think the question then really is, when is it safe and when do we all believe it's safe? And I'm just going to share a data point just as a food of thought. We are saying now at the provincial level that September is sort of the date when herd immunity happens or when we should expect to be back. I want to put forward an argument that I believe we may be wanting to consider that sooner. We are on track in Canada to be 50% of the population vaccinated by June. And I think that number is still the number that's being talked about here in Nova Scotia as well. But that's not halfway there. 50% of the population would represent everybody over the age of 40 being vaccinated. And if you go back and look at the data, that represents 99.7% of all deaths. So last year, I think, or in the last 12 months, there were 78 people that died from COVID in that age category. Compared to the flu, as an example, in Canada, there's usually between 2,000 to 8,000 people that die from the flu. We're not closing our borders because of flu every year. And I think, at 50%, if we are fortunate to be at that at June, we are probably and potentially looking at scenarios where we should really have this debate about when are we going to open up? Because further to that question about the industry being prepared, that's going to take, 3 to 4 months for many of the businesses to get ready. And relying on that domestic travel and the summer is going to be the difference between businesses making it or not, and our industry taking advantage of this or not. So I think we need to have this discussion and debate now. I understand that nobody wants to put a pin in anything, but I think talking about scenarios and likelihoods and ranges is incredibly important for our industry right now.
So on that point then, Ross, does that mean, just in terms of how we would organize this, does it mean there has to be a strong relationship between tourism and public health on this issue, or government has to strike a better balance or a better communication plan? What's the route forward on this, do you think?
Again, I don't want to suggest that the cart should be before the horse. Tourism is not what we're trying to fix here. We're trying to fix COVID. So I'm fully supportive of, everyone's attention right now in public health being on, getting the vaccine rolled out. It's an incredible task. I wouldn't want to be in charge of it. But I do think that there is an opportunity for coordination and sharing. And I think what we have to do as a community is to accept if we're going to be sharing these numbers, that we're not using it as a sword back to stab people if we can't make those dates. There's a lot of reality around disclosing information that may not become true. And I think if we can get to a point where we can share and communicate that data of, where we might be and where the possibilities are and where the thresholds would be, it sends a signal back to businesses for them to make a decision. Well, maybe I am going to get ready. Maybe I will take the risk to get prepared earlier, as opposed to it being a fait accompli that it really is. It's not going to be this year. It's going to be next year.
Right. Okay, well, talking about people with new jobs and first jobs, I don't know if anyone noticed, we have a new premier. This week, the Premier Rankin was sworn in. We have a new premier in the hot seat with a lot of new responsibilities. And I'm sure many of you know that climate change really factors very prominently in a lot of the policy, in his policy agenda. It's been put forward very forcefully. And of course, it resonates with a lot of people in our community, issues around climate change. So Michelle, I have this question for you. What is the relationship? And maybe let me also just make one other point too, to say that there was a little bit of online chatter at the McEachern Institute. We got a few comments when we posted our tourism panel about questions about environmental policies and how we think about environmental policies. So I'd like to explore this space a little bit with Michelle. What's the relationship between climate and environment policies and tourism? And how does the tourism sector need to think about the environment in the post-COVID-19 recovery?
Thanks, Kevin. So I think this is a really interesting question because tourism needs to think about this topic because travelers are thinking about this topic. And so I think that it's already happening. And of course, we've talked about, and we continue to talk about things like sustainable tourism and kind of what that means for a destination. And it's kind of table stakes now to have a sustainable tourism point of view for a destination. But I think that one of the things that I think COVID-19 has even accelerated is how much travelers are thinking about how they want to travel in the future. And they use terms like responsible travel or regenerative travel, and speaking about kind of wanting to have the least negative impact on the planet, but also, and this is kind of newer, but also to have a positive impact on the community that they're visiting. So I think that we've seen tourism in the past that's kind of wrecked communities, and I think that the idea of taking this community first approach is combining that whole idea of how does sustainability writ large fit with tourism planning and development. So that is connected to climate change. I think we've been talking about it through the lens of sustainability in the past. And I think in the future, tourism needs to do a better job of kind of understanding kind of the language and the imperatives of climate change. Certainly it's come up with respect to air travel. And I think that they've been at the kind of the leading edge of kind of that discussion, and debate has been on the leading edge of that discussion as to tourism and air travel. And I think we are going to see some the demand for international overseas travel be impacted by that. But I think that the overall, I think we have to look at this in an overall context as well, and think about the footprint of travel, making sure that our destinations are as sustainable as possible. And for coastal destinations like Atlantic Canada, for sure, that means that we have to take into consideration the impacts of climate change. And just finally, I'll just finish with one other point that I think tourism has kind of been very isolated, I think, in the past. Certainly through my career, in terms of thinking about the things that it thinks about and doing its thing, but not doing a good job of kind of influencing broader policy and having those relationships across the policy spectrum that are going to be important in the future. And I think that that's changing. And just to get to your point with our new premier, he was the Minister of Forestry before, and while he was there, he launched an advisory committee on ecological forest management. And one of the things he specifically did is make sure that tourism was represented on that panel, so on that advisory panel. So we are starting to see a recognition that tourism is getting to the table for these important discussions, and I think that bodes well, certainly in terms of this Rankin government.
Great, thank you. Just thinking about this issue about branding, this is something you talked about, Melissa, in your comments about how destinations brand themselves, and just sort of feeding out this notion of environment and how we come out of this COVID-19 recovery, how we position ourselves. So one of the things that interests me about this is I do a lot of disaster management studies. When we think about disaster studies and we think about tourism, it's usually an isolated destination that's been devastated by some hurricane, and then we think about how they're going to build back. One of the more famous Canadian examples, of course, is how Toronto responded post-SARS in 2003. They're known for having a very successful recovery where public and private sector worked together, et cetera, and they really did sort of genuinely bounce back better and develop some partnerships that still exist today. This is a little bit different, though, because everyone's been devastated. Every market's been devastated by COVID-19. So you have such an interesting perspective because your network is very international, and it's sort of it occurs to me that you might have some interesting comments. And who is going to win this race? If we're all trying to position ourselves to bounce back better, who's going to do that? How do they do that? What's the best way to bounce back and distinguish yourself, I suppose, in your recovery, knowing that everyone else is going to be trying to recover also?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, Kevin. And, I know that right now, as we're all very focused on how to get the vaccines roll out, vaccines, so we can go back to traveling again. But what's going to be really important is that messaging, that branding, that positioning, and really that investment into destination promotion that will drive people back, either from a domestic point or from an international. So I think to Ross's point in the beginning, working with the health community or the public health community specifically to understand when they'll be able to turn that messaging back on to go back into to help support their supply chain from a tourism perspective is going to be really critical. I mean, we know that people are tired of being stuck in the house. They have Zoom fatigue. I mean, you can only do so much through a computer, and people want to get out. And so there is a pent up demand, and there will be one once we do get to a place where people feel that it's safe in traveling again. But it'll be important that the investment that it is required to position destinations in a competitive marketplace, that investment remains what it is. That's how people are inspired to actually get to destinations. That's how people make decisions to decide where they're going to travel. And, I think it's going to be important in the opportunities that destinations will have is really leveraging their attributes in a different way. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the storytelling that makes destinations unique and being able to share that and invite people into their communities. And I think that will take a precedence over, I think, some of the traditional practices, but being able to be unique and setting yourself aside. But the investment that's going to be required to play in that competitive marketplace is going to be really important. I think the investment in the tourism assets to continue to develop, to bring those kind of new experiences to a destination are really important. So having a tourism master plan, having that promotional plan, having that asset plan is going to be extremely critical.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Tom, I want to pick up on some of the issues you flagged in your talk. The pandemic has revealed a number of inequalities in our society, and many people in lower paid service jobs lost their jobs or had to expose themselves to elevated risk in order to make a living, as you know. Did the pandemic shine a light on inequalities in the tourism sector that we need to address post-pandemic? And how do we address them as part of a broader bounce back better strategy so that we're in a better place going forward? How do we do that?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think, yes, I did emphasize the disproportionate impact. And it's in many societies more generally that the poorest, most vulnerable have been hit by far the hardest. By the pandemic in every sense. I think I wouldn't see this necessarily as a result of the pandemic. I think the pandemic's amplified and accelerated this. And for me, the response lies in, I think one of our participants, Denise Williams, said we need more of a focus on sustainable tourism. And I fully agree with that. But my take on sustainable tourism is on what we call the social pillar of sustainable tourism. And ultimately, that's about the people who work in the industry. And I think when companies, when organizations focus on their sustainability credentials, that needs to incorporate the people who work in the tourism businesses in exactly the same way as their concern for environmental sustainability exists. And ultimately, it goes beyond the businesses here, because I think tourism has fallen globally into a trap which is where consumers are constantly looking for the cheapest option. And this drive, whether it's through the low-cost airlines, whether it's through some of the consolidator sites offering us cheaper and cheaper and cheaper prices for hotel rooms or whatever it is, I just don't think that's sustainable. And the ultimate consequences of that are that employers are forced to pay the minimum and to work their employees the maximum in a way that isn't sustainable. And I think the pandemic has accentuated that. So I think we need to develop an industry where the consumer appreciates the value they're getting, whether it's for the meal or the bed night or the ride in an attraction or whatever it is, and isn't always looking to get the discount, because that has consequences for people's lives. So as a sort of philosophical thought, I think we as consumers need to be willing to pay a realistic amount for the experiences we're buying, which I would argue globally at the moment we do not.
Tom, just a further thought on this. Do you think the responsibility lies on the market side for consumers to appreciate this point, or is this really a market failure the government has to address more aggressively? That the government's going to have to step in with stronger regulations on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a case for that. I mean, when you're offered flights for what, $5.99 or whatever it is, which we still do see here, especially as part of airlines recovery strategy, I just don't think that has any moral or any moral justification. I just cannot. I can understand it from a promotional point of view, but in terms of its impact on the people who are directly affected by that, particularly the workforce, there is no justification for that, because it means ultimately a squeezing of their opportunities and their lifestyle opportunities. And tourism is particularly in larger urban destinations, tourism is very much a pyramidical industry, with the most vulnerable, the diversity that Melissa was rightly advocating, the representations of that diversity overrepresented in the bottom quartile, in the bottom of that pile, and therefore they're the ones who get literally crushed by that sort of philosophy. So yes.
Right. Okay. I want to invite people from our audience to submit questions. There have been questions coming in, and I want to just bring them to our attention and maybe and give voice to some of these questions. Some concerns around the cruise industry, of course. Information was shared recently that cruises will not be coming to Atlantic Canada for the next year, and then we'll see. The question really is, what's the road look like for the cruise industry? What is the impact for our region? And I think that was a question that was sent to you, Ross. Do you want to pick that one up on the response to the impact on cruise for our region?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd welcome other panelists as well, but I think, cruise obviously took a bit of a black eye. It was highlighted early in the pandemic, from the media around those particular stories. But that's not the first time that this has happened to cruise. It's happened many times before, and they have bounced back. I think the fundamentals behind that market are incredibly strong. Cruise is still growing. Most people in the markets that are cruising into Atlantic Canada are still first-time cruisers. I think the percentages in the single digits of people that have cruised from the United States. And so, I think so long as we get back to everything being safe and COVID behind us, I think that this industry is going to bounce back hard. I mean, it's being held back right now because, first of all, it's international travel. But when that hurdle, I think, gets resolved, we're probably going to see pent-up demand for cruise. And yes, there will be people that will never cruise again, and you'll hear those anecdotal stories. But I think the fundamentals behind travel and behind that particular market are still solid.
Great. I got a question about vaccines from Gordon Stewart. How should we view our visitors that have not had a vaccination and do not plan to do so? Is this a filter that we should be exercising in the future? That could be a large number, hard on positive messaging. Any thoughts on the notion of the vaccination passport, or if this is something we should be considering in order to allow visitors to come? Who wants to take that one? Go ahead, Michelle.
I can start with that because I think that's a really great question that Gordon is asking, and I think that this is something that governments are actually going to need to kind of grapple with. But what's happening out there in the marketplace is the marketplace is already dealing with this through this new app that IATA, the international, the airline international alliance, has launched an app. It's being introduced with Air New Zealand starting April 1st. They are basically being able to, through biometric means, match your passport with your vaccination information and proof of vaccination. And so I think that airlines, kind of generally speaking, and they've got other airlines, Singapore, Emirates, coming on board as well with this particular app. So I think we're going to see private sector kind of doing this. I mean, we've already dealt with it in the travel industry for years. I mean, I traveled to Peru a few years ago. I had to have proof of yellow fever vaccination. So that's been common. But I think that what Gordon's question is getting to, I think a little bit more, is kind of how is that going to work on the local level? In terms of vaccines to get into events and things of that nature. That's something that we haven't seen yet, and governments haven't really weighed in on that. But I think that local people who are wanting to go to the events are also going to have a big point of view about that. Like, do you want to be close by someone who's not vaccinated? So that's as much as we're going to be talking about people who can't get vaccinated and where does that leave them? And those are important questions. But people who have been vaccinated are also going to have are going to think a lot about that. So this is a big thorny question. I think that for air travel, it's probably already that ship has left, but horse has left the barn, I guess. But I think that we don't have any clarity on how that's going to roll out at the kind of the local city level.
I'd welcome some comments from our international friends on this, on the question of the vaccination passport. If you have any views on that, how you see it from your corner of the world. Melissa, have you got your mic on?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to make a comment because this is a conversation we have internally at our association and in the industry. But the reality is, COVID is not going to go away necessarily. And so we have to think about it in the perspective that we're going to have to live with this, and how do we learn to live with this? And so I know right now the hardest part for the public is that we don't know enough. We're waiting to catch up with science, and science is waiting to catch up with the virus. And so I just want to add that little tidbit of perspective that as we continue to think strategically how we recover, we're going to have to remember that it's not going to disappear. We're going to have to adjust. And I think that's the hardest part for, I think, communities and our industry to kind of get past right now, but we will, and we will be successful in doing that.
Excellent. Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think this debate is churning very active in the UK at the moment, and we have a UK Cabinet Commission looking at it at the moment. And the focus is not on travel in terms of the vaccine passport or whatever you want to call it. In fact, there's very little sympathy for, at government level for people wanting to see it as a passport to travel. It's very much more around local engagement. Some employers are intimating they're going to demand it of their employees, etc. So, and there's been an outcry also in terms of the sequencing of the vaccine, which, as is the case in Canada, is focusing primarily on older people. So young people who will be the last to get the vaccination will also be the last to get the passport. And there is a kickback against that. So I think there's all sorts of debates, but I come from a country which rejected the idea of national ID cards a few years ago. And that it is anything that smacks of government control over or access to our lives on a daily basis does kick up a reaction in certain parts of the population. I think the reality is that we will get some form of a health passport, but how that'll operate and how it'll be managed securely is a real issue.
Thanks, Tom. We're effectively out of time, but I want to just throw this one last question out from Denise Williams to you, Ross, on this question about, because I know you've just launched your plan, and I want to just pick on maybe on this question about, is there enough business for us to concentrate really on Atlantic Canada to move forward? Can that sustain us maybe in the short term, more effort at conferences and events locally? On a local audience, can we move it forward that way for the time being? Is that part of the strategy, or is that just not big enough?
Well, look, it was definitely the core of the strategy for last year, and I think as we move into this new period, it's not a strategy that's sustainable for the long term. We do know that it's about 60% of our visitors are coming from the Atlantic Canadian region, the overnight visitors to Halifax, but they stay shorter periods, they spend less. The real opportunity and the need is really in the domestic market, and then followed up by the premium markets, which are the international markets. So, I'm afraid that another summer just relying on the regional market is going to be incredibly difficult for many businesses to be able to sustain another year. Most businesses in this industry need to make their money during that very condensed season to get them through the winter period. And I think another year of just a regional market is going to be incredibly hard for that to succeed.
But is that the same for conventions? Can we do local conventions? Is there some possibilities there?
No, I mean, look, there are definitely local meetings and things that happen, but the conventions industry is a market of its own. It's for us, it's largely a domestic market. Yes, meetings and business travel will be important, but the conventions market really does rely on the national meetings and national associations getting together every year. So it wouldn't be enough to really sustain the market here for I think for any community in the Atlantic Canadian region.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your thoughts on that. I want to thank everyone who participated in today's panel, our very thoughtful comments from our panelists, as well as the audience who've logged in and asked questions. I'd like to remind everyone that next week's panel is on climate adaptation in Nova Scotia, overblown or underwater, and it'll take place next Thursday at 1 p.m. And we invite you to join us there. This panel will be available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Please share it with those who are interested in this important debate around policy. So thanks again so much to our panelists for sharing your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed the discussion. I thought it was very, very rich and robust. Lots of great ideas for us to think about. So we'll take it and we'll take it home with us, and we'll think about some of these policy ideas that emerge from this discussion. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye now.
Thank you.